Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. It's almost the end of January, Wednesday, January 29th in the year 2025. Today is day 481 since October 7th, 2023. The news is overrun with pictures and videos of hundreds of thousands of Gazans returning or seeking to return home to the north of Gaza, wondering if their homes might even be there when they arrive. Reports indicate that the number is over 300,000 who've made the northern trek in the Gazan enclave. They're seeking not only to return home, but to see what semblances of their property and businesses, and many of their relatives continue to remain under the rubble. So every single day, there are reports of how many dead have been retrieved as rubble day after day is moved. I wanted to call your attention. Churches for Middle East Peace joined the humanitarian snapshot with the Global Ceasefire Coalition. This is number 9. This one focuses specifically on the 1-year anniversary of the International Court of Justice's aid measures, and it seeks to identify how much Israel was in compliance with that International Court of Justice's provisional measure that was given a year ago. The measure said the state of Israel should take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. That mandate was given a year ago. The report concludes and indicates, with citing significant evidence, that not only did Israel not comply with the International Court of Justice order, but that there was negative progress in all 5 of the indicators and areas that the provisional measure calls for. This includes delivering timely, efficient, and scalable humanitarian assistance, food, water, shelter and clothing, hygiene, medical supplies, and care to meet the needs of the more than 2.2 million people living in Gaza. Just one example, Gaza City, that so many of the Palestinians are seeking to return to, 3/4 of the homes have been reported in Gaza City to be partially damaged or destroyed. That's just one example. There were 5 measurements that were evaluated in the report. The sufficient provision of essential assistance between January 2024 and 2025, it fell below the minimum required to sustain life. Number 2, Israel systematically denied and restricted the delivery of aid supplies into Gaza. Again, evidence is provided. 3, Israel systematically denied and impeded humanitarian access inside of Gaza. 4, Israeli authorities' policies and actions dismantled the humanitarian architecture and operational environment in the Strip. And 5, systematic attacks by the Israeli forces on basic services and humanitarian infrastructure and personnel were reported. You could see videos of Israeli soldiers blowing up water supplies, for example, but this included the reality that 377 aid workers have been killed in that year-long period, and 262 health workers were arbitrarily detained by the Israeli forces since October 7th of 2023. Yesterday in Gaza, an Israeli contractor was killed at the Nexrim axis after being shot at by Israeli soldiers who mistakenly thought he was Palestinian. In terms of negotiations towards the ceasefire, Israeli media and prison authorities have called families of Palestinian prisoners who will be released this weekend to inform them that their family members will be deported from Palestine. So those being released will not go to the occupied territories, but instead would go to foreign countries. Israeli troops killed 2 Palestinians in the cities of Jenin and Tulkarem in the occupied West Bank overnight. And shifting to U.S. engagement, President Trump is set to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on February 4th. We don't know where that will be or much more at this point. That was announced on X last night, Tuesday night. While Trump's envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, has been pushing for progression on the ceasefire agreement, Middle East Persian Gulf states consider their post-war role. Wealthy Arab nations have considered and are considering bankrolling Gaza's reconstruction, but they want assurances that Palestinians will lead in the post-war period. In other words, the full and complete removal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip. Witkoff is in the Middle East this week. He first went to Saudi Arabia, then Israel. Today, he went into Gaza. I'll talk about that in a minute. According to reports, he was working on a broad Middle East agreement that would include not only the reconstruction of Gaza, but eventually the normalization of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Earlier this week, Trump doubled down on his comments about Gaza and the need for the population there to be removed. He argues that it's necessary in order to rebuild. Late on Monday, he said, when you look at the Gaza Strip, it has been hell. As a reminder, the initial ceasefire agreement that began on the 19th of January is supposed to last for 42 days, after which Hamas will release the remaining hostages and Israel would withdraw all of its troops from Gaza. Only then is when reconstruction would begin, along with negotiations over the political future of Gaza. Saudi Arabia, sources close to the palace there have said, is committed to its demands that post-war plans in Gaza be directly tied to a political roadmap. That's a very important word, roadmap for a Palestinian state. President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority thinks it's inadequate because Oslo, the peace process in the early 90s, was a roadmap. And while there was a map towards political peace, settlements have been built, land has been confiscated, homes have been destroyed. So a roadmap is considered inadequate by the Palestinians. Look where we are now, 30 years later, from the Oslo Accords. It's also important to note that countries that previously signed normalization agreements with Israel, like the UAE, have come under incredible pressure during the Israel-Hamas war to cut their economic and political ties with Israel. Also back in DC, you've heard about the chaos happening because of the Trump offer to U.S. government employees to leave their jobs and take severance over the next several months. There are many reasons there's chaos in DC, but the Trump administration also put foreign assistance on hold, except to Israel and Egypt. I've been talking about that in the last couple of days. Yesterday, Secretary of State Rubio approved a new waiver that exempts, quote, core life-saving medicine, medical services, food, shelter, and subsistence assistance from the U.S. aid freeze, according to a memo. I won't get into all the things the Trump administration is doing. We would be here quite a long time. The U.S. military this week did transfer about 90 Patriot air defense interceptors from their storage in Israel. So the U.S. military has storage in Israel. 90 Patriot air defense interceptors got transferred from the U.S. stores in Israel to Poland with a view to deliver them to Ukraine. In the U.S., Senate Democrats blocked legislation to sanction the International Criminal Court. We thought this would pass. They blocked the measure to pass it. Elizabeth Warren said the move reflected the Democrats' anger over Trump's federal aid freeze attempt. Israel's ban on the UN aid agency, UNRWA, will be disastrous. The Commissioner General Lazzarini told the UN Security Council yesterday. The acting U.S. ambassador to the UN, Dorothy Shea, said the U.S. supports Israel's sovereign right to close UNRWA's offices, calling Lazzarini's remarks irresponsible and dangerous. UNRWA, is set to respond to the needs of Palestinian refugees, which by international law Israel should have no authority over. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu will meet with Trump. I already mentioned that. The Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff met yesterday with a senior advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. That was ahead of Witkoff's visit to Gaza that happened today. He went into Gaza, Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy. He was traveling with the Israeli military, and he went into the Netzarim corridor, which separates northern Gaza from the Strip's center and south. Very little was published about his observations and the experience there, but he traveled alongside of Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer. According to Hebrew media in Israel, Witkoff was shown inspections of Palestinian vehicles, which in recent days have been allowed to move northward under the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Hamas should never govern Gaza again, Secretary Rubio told his Egyptian counterpart in a phone call yesterday, the State Department said. And Jordan yesterday launched an air bridge to bring urgent medical supplies to Gaza under a U.S.-sponsored deal, Jordanian officials said. You should know Jordan was one of the countries on hold in terms of the State Department decision for aid. Israel struck and injured 24 people in South Lebanon in Nabatea city yesterday. The Israel military claimed it targeted Hezbollah vehicles transporting weapons. Prime Minister Makati, the caretaker prime minister, said he raised the incident with the ceasefire monitoring committee. In Syria, Russia's deputy foreign minister and a special envoy to Syria arrived in Damascus. This is the first official visit of Russia to visit the country since the Assad regime fell. Israeli troops will remain on Syria's Mount Hermon summit indefinitely, according to the according to the Israeli Defense Minister Katz. Israeli officials had previously said that the move to Mount Hermon and the summit was limited and temporary. Mount Hermon is on the border of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. I mentioned yesterday Netanyahu's corruption trial has resumed after a month-long pause. Netanyahu has denied discussing personal matters with an aide who was one of the key witnesses used against him. And so I won't get into those details, but that has been continuing. An update on the Knesset vote in Israel about Israelis purchasing property in the occupied West Bank. The Knesset approved the preliminary vote for the bill, which is called to eliminate discrimination in real estate purchases in Judea and Samaria. It was first proposed in 2023. According to the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din, the proposed bill aims to ease the purchase of land in the occupied territory by settlers and expand the settlement enterprise. It seeks to establish permanent changes in land ownership in the West Bank by enabling for the first time individual Israelis to buy land directly instead of the current requirement that land be bought through companies registered with the Civil Administration Companies Registry. This kind of ownership would be permanent and irreversible. Finally, on Sunday, our programs and outreach manager, many of you have met her, Destiny Magnet, joined the first congregational UCC in Amherst, Massachusetts. She delivered a guest sermon and led a post-worship conversation about current events and our call to Christian witness in the Middle East. She preached on 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and called worshipers to adopt an expansive idea of what unity can mean, moving beyond relationships with those like us and towards a world where we can love actively across differences. This is the prayer she closed with, and I close with it today as well. We prayed it on our Wednesday prayer service this morning. Creator God, help us to see your sacred images in the face of our expansive human community. Open our hearts to be guided by the Spirit to work toward common good. Give us the courage to love better, and especially to remember the humanity of those who we may see as others or enemies. Lead us to know our gifts and how to best use them in service of a just world at peace. And above all, let our hearts remain softened to both the suffering and the hope of this broken world. May it be so in the name of Christ. Amen.